At what point did Canadians just stop caring about their government was lighting their money on fire? Because that's what's happening. You work, you pay taxes, and you expect, naively perhaps, that the people in Ottawa will treat your money with some respect, but they don't. The numbers don't lie. In 2024, the average Canadian family, whether a household or just an individual, earned about $114,000. Out of that, almost half, $48,000, went straight to the taxes. 42% of your income. Think about that for a second. You work 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. It's not until lunch on Wednesday that you start earning for yourself. Everything before that, gone, straight into the government coffers. We live in a country where $130 million can vanish into this so-called entrepreneurship fund with nothing to show for it. No startups, no jobs, nothing but fake success stories fed to Parliament by a Liberal cabinet minister named Mary Nigg. And what's Ottawa's response? Did they tighten the oversight, demand accountability? No, they just rolled out a shiny new bureaucracy, the Major Projects Office, a one-stop shop for waste that already reeks of the same old, same old. Put simply, they're doubling down on failure. Cabinet tells us they're building a stronger economy, but every time we look under the hood, it's just the same story: waste, mismanagement, and fake success stories. We just found out that the Women's Entrepreneurship Fund burned through $130 million of taxpayer money. It didn't create a single startup, not one new job. And now, as if on cue, the Liberals are rolling out another shiny bureaucracy. This isn't new. We've seen it before. Remember SDTC, Sustainable Development Technology Canada. It was billed as the Great Green Tech Innovation Fund. But when Parliament Industry and Technology Committee, INDU, started digging, what did they find? Conflicts of interest, money flowing to insiders, and a government department that knew about the problems but did nothing. It took whistleblowers, the Auditor General, and MPs like Rick Perkins to expose it. So today, we have Rick Perkins here to talk about the pattern. Why does Ottawa keep inventing programs that waste billions and deliver nothing? Why does every innovation fund or fast track office end up riddled with the same rot? Insiders rewarded, taxpayers fleeced, no accountability. And most importantly, how do we stop it? Rick, welcome.
Great to be here, Dan. Nice to see you.
Rick, I'd love to talk to you about what your thoughts about this new one-stop shop office. You know, we have a woman named Dawn Farrell heading the office. I'm not sure if you know about Dawn Farrell. She was the same person that ran she worked for Trans Mountain, and and let's be clear, she inherited a mess. She inherited a project that was already billions over budget, but instead of tightening the screws, plugging the leaks, and enforcing efficiency, under her leadership, the price tag didn't stabilize, exploded. Cost went from 21 billion, and they exploded to 30 billion in just a year. By completion, it was 34 billion. It was one of the most expensive infrastructure projects in Canadian history. And when ordinary Canadians, journalists, watchdogs, they tried to find out what was happening through the Access to Information Act, what did Farrell's Trans Mountain do? They stonewalled. They literally refused to answer questions, claiming that neither confirmed nor denied information existed. The Information Commissioner of Canada said, no, that's not acceptable. She ruled against the company and ordered Farrell's office to comply. And she still didn't. The commissioner had to do something she never done in Canadian history. She went to the federal court and sought a right of mandamus, a court order forcing the CEO of Trans Mountain to obey a law and release the records. That happened under her watch. And now she's in charge of this new one-stop shop office. Rick, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Wow, there's a lot of stuff there, Dan. Well,
Yeah,
let's start there at the end on the one-stop shop and maybe come back to the $130 million to start new businesses that didn't start a new business, or the billion-dollar green slush fund that was supposed to provide, new innovative technology but padded Liberal pockets. But I've never met the new head of the project office, but let's just think about that concept before we talk about necessarily the record of the individual at TMX. Does anyone that's watching ever think or believe or seen that the creation of a new government bureaucracy actually speeds things up? I can't name one instant where it is. So what we're going to do in the Carney government is they're going to have a project office to actually funnel all the things that come from the departments to try and help them figure out what it is they should know anyway that they should build in infrastructure. Like they want to build a new bureaucracy. There's already two housing bureaucracies. They want to build a third to oversee the other two housing bureaucracies to deal with our housing crunch. In this case, the new CEO of this new bureaucracy oversaw Trans Mountain Pipeline. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, Dan, actually started at 7 billion and went to 34 billion, right? So not exactly, I'd say, tight, efficient management of budgets. And I'll tell you, I met with a lot of people in my time in Parliament around how does a $7 billion pipeline become 34 billion? And it comes that way apparently because Trudeau's and the Liberals' Impact Assessment Act required them to do a lot of things that we didn't have to do before in building stuff. Things like moving anthills. They had to move 14 anthills in the construction. Like, I don't know about you, but if I've got an anthill problem in my yard, I go to Canadian Tire and I buy some ant out, right? So I asked the folks at the time, I said, were these sort of special ants? Endangered ants, chocolate covered ants? What were they that they required movement? No, they were just ordinary everyday ants, but they had to relocate them. I couldn't figure out, they wouldn't tell me how much that cost. But one person who was involved in the project told me, I can't tell you, but it probably cost about $1 million an ant to move them. Ordinary ants. They had birds that would come and nest close to the construction. And they would have construction shut down at anywhere from a $30,000 to $60,000 a day cost of the shutdown. In one case, it was a swallow, not some special swallow, not a Monty Python swallow, not that great discussion from the Holy Grail about swallows, but it was just an ordinary swallow that flew in, and they had to stop construction for 6 weeks. 6 weeks.
You're kidding me. Six weeks
no,
they had to shut
6
down.
weeks. At that kind of cost. And when they asked why, they were told, well, they're not acclimatized to the noise of construction. And the folks involved said, but we're right by the Trans-Canada Highway, which is even noisier. Oh, no. The birds are normalized to that sound. They're not normalized to the sound of your construction. This is the craziness. They actually had bureaucrats under the Impact Assessment Act, the IAA, the bill that parts of it were declared unconstitutional last year by the Supreme Court. They actually had bureaucrats in the Environment Department whose job it was to open up every garbage bag on the construction site to make sure things were in the right recycle bag. And if they weren't, stuff would stop until they figured out how did that reusable plastic bottle or a one-time use bottle end up in the wrong bag. I mean, that's how you know, it isn't like in Independence Day where they actually have a secret mountain where they actually have a spaceship and they don't actually pay $500 for a hammer in the US military. I mean, this is actual government bureaucracy that caused these escalations. So there's the bureaucracy and projects that the Impact Assessment Act, it's better known as the No Pipelines Bill, Bill C-69, the bureaucracy that requires in getting the approval. Then there's the bureaucracy and once you've got the approval of actually building it, which there isn't a lot of discussion on. So, you know, I don't see how a person who oversaw the expansion of that cost, pipeline was the same on day one as it was on the completion. The design was the same, everything was the same. That somehow somebody who managed a $7 billion pipeline to $34 billion is all of a sudden going to create more government efficiency in getting things built. I think government bureaucracy is probably what's going to happen there. And we see that in everything. You know, my time as industry critic, the billions and billions and billions of dollars the industry department spends, like the program you mentioned, the Windman's Entrepreneur Startup Program, where the Auditor General found $130 million spent. Oh, sorry, it was Parliamentary Budget Officer, I think.
It was the auditor. It was, I believe, it was. Yeah, you're right. It was a parliamentary budget officer, but $130 million spent. Not one single startup created, not one job created.
For a startup program. So I'm sure there were bureaucratic jobs that were created, but there's a gazillion of these programs in that department. The federal government collects about $100 billion in taxes from a year from businesses, small businesses, medium, large businesses. And then it gives 50 billion of it back to businesses and to do certain things, either through straight out grants like that ridiculous program, or in tax credits to lower a corporate tax rate to incent them to do certain things. So think of that. We collect 100 billion and then the government decides to give 50 billion of it back, and it does it really badly. The largest program annually is one that's existed for about 70 years. It's called SHRED, the Scientific Research Tax Credit. And about a third, it's about $5 billion a year right now is being spent on that. And for about 8 years, the Liberal government has promised to reform it, and no reforms have happened. We have a thing in Parliament. It's called an order paper question. So you can ask a question for numbers, statistics, that kind of thing, and the government has to supply it to Parliament within 45 days. I asked a question and said, could you please tell me in each of the last 10 years, the categories of intellectual property patents that resulted from this $5 billion a year expenditure by region, by industry, not by company, because that's a privacy issue, by industry, by region, and what's the country of origin of the beneficial owner of that tax credit. And that word beneficial owner is key, because to get the tax credit, all you have to be is a registered company in Canada, but you don't have to be a Canadian shareholder. Beneficial owner is the shareholder who actually benefits from the money. So where are they in the world? So Revenue Canada got back to me with a 1-paragraph answer to the biggest tax credit we have for business and said, we don't track whether it produces any intellectual property, and we don't track who the beneficial owner is. So we have no idea who this biggest tax credit whether it goes. You know, there are rumors that the top 20 users of that tax credit are actually foreign multinationals. So through numbered companies in Canada. So this is the kind of stuff that goes on. No output, right? Can't tell you what it actually produces, but we'll spend $5 billion a year on the SHRED tax credit. We'll create a startup for women entrepreneurs that won't create a single startup. We'll give $1 billion to create pre-commercialized green technology companies, and then we'll put a bunch of our friends on the board, Liberal friends on the board, who then would funnel the money to their companies. And there is no penalty for that other than public shaming.
I'm glad you brought up the cronyism. It just seems like it's some people have labeled it almost like a swamp, and it seems like it's almost an aptly named analogy for what people are actually dealing with. It seems like that a small amount of people are able to thrive in this government, the machinations of this government machine that has all this bureaucracy. We've seen it time and time again. Arrivecan was a great example of that, where we had Liberal appointed insiders like Cameron McDonald, who was chummy with contractors, pushed it off these contracts to GC Strategies, who then went ahead and started working with other contractors. So it was contractor on contractor, and then they were working together. And if you watch that committee, it was like they were getting benefits, they were getting steak dinners, they were going to cabins. It was one of the most egregious examples of government waste I've ever seen. When you were reflecting at your time as vice chair of the INDU committee, the industry committee, what initially tipped off the conflicts of interest in your mind, the SDTC, and how did those early whistleblower complaints shape your approach to the investigation?
Great question. I think it was January, February 2023. I think I've got my year right. I got a brown envelope in the office. Yeah, people still do brown envelopes. I got a brown envelope with a bunch of printed materials on this from what turned out to be the whistleblower who ended up appearing in committee a few times, on what was going on at this organization called Sustainable Development Technology Canada. It was set up in 2001 by the Chrétien Martin government to take a bet and do some grants to pre-commercialize. So they don't have revenue yet, but green technology companies. That's probably the hardest stage of financing. Friends and family, venture capital. Maybe the government can help on some of this green technology stuff. So all a fairly good thought at the time, and it did a lot of good work over the years. It actually did. In sort of around 2010, 2015, it had, just before, Harper was still in power, they discovered that the CEO was feathering her own bed. So they cleaned the place up, they cleaned it out, they put in a new board and cleaned the place up and got a clean bill of health on some of the, I'll call minor corruptions of expenses and stuff, and the way they were doing things in 2017 from Treasury Board and from the Auditor General. But then The chair of the board today, a fellow named Jim Balsillie, your viewers may know Jim as the co-founder of BlackBerry, who wasn't doing this for the money, started to appear before parliamentary committees criticizing the Trudeau government on issues around digital privacy, the abuse of your personal information by the big global social media giants, and the lack of any laws in Canada to deal with protecting your privacy. And they actually, through the president of SDTC at the time, asked him if he would basically shut up. It's like he doesn't need the job, right? Like
Yeah.
Jim has a lot of business interests. He was doing this for the good of the country. And so he wouldn't, because he believes in these issues. He's very vocal on them still. And in terms of protection of personal privacy and data usage. And so they fired him. They gave him like less than a week's notice and said, you're being replaced by a woman named Annette Vachon, who then was warned, they warned the minister of the day, Navdeep Bains, a Liberal minister, the president said, you can't appoint her chair because we actually do business with her companies. We actually have grants, taxpayer money that's gone to her companies. She'll be in a conflict of interest. She'll be the first chair of the board in the history of this organization that's conflicted. And Navdeep Bains, who works at Rogers now, Navdeep Bains came back and said, we'll manage the conflicts. Don't worry about it. So when she came in, the whole culture of the place changed at SDTC. So we called it the Liberal $1 billion green slush fund. It's actually over the years has gotten about $2 billion, but under the Trudeau and the current Liberals, they got over $1 billion. And the whistleblower made such a stink about this, and I brought it forward in committees. But finally, he got fed up. He actually spent time with the government department, industry department, with the senior people, the assistant deputy ministers, going through all the detail and wasn't getting anywhere with the minister of the day, Minister Champagne, who's now the finance minister, wasn't getting anywhere. So he went to the Globe and Mail, and the Globe and Mail started to produce stories on this. We were asking questions in Parliament, and it just sort of steamrollered from there. We asked the Auditor General to come in. The Auditor General came in and did an audit and found in their audit that of the 852, the period of time that she looked at where $852 million of taxpayer money went out the door to stuff, they did a sample size audit, a spot audit that's statistically valid. So they found out of a little over 400 transactions, 186 were conflicted. That totaled about $400 million. So that's $400 million where they conflicted, where through a series of 9 directors on the board, money was flowing to firms that they had financial interest in and conflicts in. And that's what started the whole thing going. Parliamentary inquiries in the industry committee, in the public accounts committee, and the government operations committee, all of which led up to the motion that we did. We have a thing called opposition days in the House. So we had a vote in the House that the government turn over all the documents related to, in the government, related to SDTC to the RCMP. Pretty simple request. That was passed in June of 2024, passed the House. So that means the Conservatives, the Bloc, the NDP, and even the Greens, I believe, all voted for that. The only people that voted not to turn those over was the Liberals. And they had 30 days to do so. And over a period of the next 3 or 4 months, they turned documents over, but they were redacted. They were blacked out. And so they actually turned over 29,000 pages of documents, most of them blanked out, that you couldn't actually see. And
I think I saw one of those. I think I saw one of those pages there. Like it was a full page.
Whole page was black.
Just black.
I held them up a few times. So when the House came back in September, the first thing we did, our House leader did, Andrew Scheer did, was do a breach of parliamentary privilege motion to the Speaker That was, and on September 26th last year, the speaker ruled in our favor and said that the House of Commons was a prima facie case, basically that the Liberals, the Crown, the government had broken and not complied with an order of the House. The time they had done that previously was over the Winnipeg Labs, where the speaker actually had to take the government to court to get the documents released around the Winnipeg Labs and the Chinese spies that were in that lab that were fired. And so that was found in breach. And so we started a debate on that issue. And that took up the House until Justin Trudeau prorogued it at Christmas last year. And the Liberals would call it our filibuster because we kept debating it. But it was actually a Liberal filibuster because they wouldn't turn the documents over. The simplest way to deal with getting back to the business of the House was for them to comply with the House order. And this may seem arcane to people, right? Like a House order, big deal. What's that? A bunch of MPs voted against it. Well, we represent the majority of Canadians said, release these documents. It goes back 400 years. It's a fundamental parliamentary principle. When the House orders something, the Crown, represented by cabinet, has to comply. Goes back to the Magna Carta, but that's 800 years. But it goes back to King Charles I having his head chopped off over the debate about who was supreme, Parliament or the Crown. And so it's a very fundamental thing. You may not like it, but when the government orders it, you got to do it. So we're talking about something where 44% of all the transactions that went out from this organization were conflicted, that were the directors, the Liberal, the Justin Trudeau, the Liberal hand-picked directors were all in a conflict. Every single one of them were handing out money to companies that they were conflicted with. $400 million, 44% of the time. Like that's not a mistake. That's actually breaking two acts. They broke the Conflict of Interest Act and the SDTC Act. They both say basically that if you're a public office holder, which they were on this, you cannot personally, and your family cannot personally benefit from holding this office. Well, what greater benefit is there than giving your own companies that you have a financial interest in money from the taxpayer, increasing their value?
And you would think that they didn't have, like, it was just a board of directors, but in fact, they had deputy ministers sit in on these. And
Assistant deputy minister.
Yeah, assistant deputy minister. And he was basically clapping like a seal that this was all on the level.
And they get the minutes of the board meetings too. So not only was the assistant deputy minister in every one of these things, so the board members had to recuse themselves. So it's like, okay, Dan, your company's coming up, so leave the meeting. Now let's have a vote. Who wants to give Dan's company some money? Right? Dan comes back in and goes, oh crap, look, it's Rick's time. The company's up. Well, Rick, it's 44% of the time, so it's not like it wasn't happening every meeting. I got to leave the meeting now, and then Dan goes and votes for my money. Like, come on, guys. This is $400 million of taxpayer money. And they say, well, it was a specialized industry. It's not a specialized industry. The easiest way to avoid a conflict is not to give yourself money and to say either, if I need that money, I won't sit on this board. And if the company does need that money, then it shouldn't apply here, or I shouldn't be on the board. Like, sure. You can't have both, right? And the sanction for that was shame. We had the ethics commissioner conflicts in the committee, and I said, so like, why aren't you doing this? 186 of 226 transactions that the Auditor General looked at were conflicted. And so how do you do this? How do you say that that's okay? And he said, well, they're no longer on the board, so I have no role as the ethics commissioner. I said, so if you were the ethics commissioner, what's the sanction? Well, there is no sanction other than public exposure and force you to resign from it. But nobody's paid any of this money back. We asked the deputy minister of the day, he's no longer there, Simon Kennedy, the deputy minister, should this be paid back if these folks were in a conflict of interest? And he said yes. Of course, the documents haven't been turned over. Not a dollar of any conflict of interest has been repaid. So whether it's the $130 million of whatever that was creating, the shred tax credit, that goes to foreign multinationals. We could talk about the National Engineering Research Council. It gets $1.6 billion a year to do research in universities. Not enough to do engineering and science research, so they match it up. Almost all of it is matched with private sector money. Good thing. Turn $1.6 billion into $3 billion of research. Good thing. That's smart thinking. In 90% of the cases, that's done with money from a foreign multinational. And that foreign multinational owns any of the research that comes out of it. So what the taxpayer does is pays the National Engineering Science Research Council $1.6 billion, to produce $3 billion of research a year, which then gets owned by a foreign company that if it produces something out of it, we as Canadians buy back at retail. Like, how does that make any sense? No wonder we have a horribly unproductive economy when we're subsidizing foreign companies and they can produce these products elsewhere on taxpayer dime, or that we allow liberal appointees to send money to their own companies, or sheer incompetence of a startup that they're trying to shovel money out of the door, $130 million, and don't actually pay attention to the rules, the bureaucrats on that.
I think you mentioned a lot about red tape, about crippling our own industries, and I can't agree with you more. I mean, when we look at this carbon tax, it's just basically especially now that they're trying to push this industrial carbon tax, it's just more bureaucracy. It cripples our own industry, and the worst part about it, Rick, and when I look at the carbon tax, we don't tax imports with the same carbon tax. So we are basically offloading all of our industrial capacity to countries like China who don't have who don't have places like unions. Right. They don't care about the environment. And then they ship it back to us. And everyone in the government's like, look, like we're all about green energy. And it's like, look, like it's one of the most dishonest policies, I think, in government right now, because it doesn't stop carbon. You've literally just offloaded it, and it's very frustrating to me as a Canadian that we don't talk a lot about it more. But
let's talk about the three carbon taxes. The one supposedly is gone, the consumer carbon tax, right? That we fought for 2 years.
Yeah.
That Mark Carney said wasn't expensive enough. He got rid of, but there are two other carbon taxes. The other one's called the Clean Fuel Standard. It's about 9 cents a liter on your gas, going to 17 cents. So carbon tax 2. Pierre had a press conference last week in PEI demanding that they remove carbon tax 2, which is going to 17 cents a liter and hurting our economy. And we've talked a lot about the industrial carbon tax, which is harder for people to understand, but basically it's a carbon tax on carbon emitting industries like steel, which is in the news a bit with Trump's tariffs, right? One of the best things that the Carney government could do right now to help our steel industry is take off the industrial carbon tax off of steel. It's a tax that American steel producers don't pay, but ours do. In one of the big three pays $500 million a year in industrial carbon taxes to Ottawa, $500 million. And we're wondering why our steel isn't competitive in the US besides the Trump issues on tariff. Our own government is making them uncompetitive with the industrial carbon tax. And nobody seems to care. Even the steel industry, Pierre talked a year or so ago about, businesses need to fight for their own industries, right? And we don't see them fighting enough for their own industries. And we don't see the steel industry. Have you heard the steel industry saying, out of the long list of things that we need to deal with Trump tariffs, we need the industrial carbon tax gone?
I think I was listening to CPAC and they were saying that talking about steel, talking about manufacturing, us offloading manufacturing off to other countries, specifically the $1.5 billion shipping deal that here in BC was offloaded to China. And again, we're talking about regulations. Well, everyone says, well, China's just more competitive than us. Well, why are they more competitive than us? They don't have the same red tape, the same bureaucracy that we have to deal with. They don't care about the carbon. They don't have a clean fuel tax. They don't have this industrial carbon tax. They're just able to, because they don't care. They're just like, well,
and China dumps steel into Canada.
Yeah.
In Trump 1, he imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada in his first round as president. And one of the conditions for removing those tariffs, which Trump did during the first one, was that we put in place an electronic monitoring system that was available for everyone to see, that identified all the steel that comes into Canada. We import a lot of steel in Canada, uh, where it was forged, because we are a dumping ground for Chinese steel into Canada, which eventually makes its way into the United States. And the US agreed to do the same thing. And before Trump finished his term in 2020, they had their electronic monitoring registry system for where steel was forged public and up and running. You know, when Canada put their commitment, which ended up removing the tariffs and Trump won, do you know when the Liberals actually got that registry running? January 20th, 2025, Inauguration Day. So as soon as Trump lost, they said, screw that. And then we wonder why they're pissed off at us, because we've continued to allow Chinese steel to come in through the back door through Canada and into the United States, harming not only our steel industry, but the US steel industry. So now the US has 4 or 5 years of data on where the steel is forged, and we only have it since January. Like, I'm not defending Trump, but the reality is that we've had an incompetent Liberal government that's put us in a lot of these positions, and that they can do some easy things right now to help our steel industry by removing the industrial carbon tax.
You know, you talk about outputs and you're talking about, like measuring, outcomes. And it just seems like it's like, it just seems such an amount of a waste. And when we talk about access to information, transparency, it's supposed to be the bedrock of democracy. Sunlight on how our money is spent, who's making decisions, and what's really going on in Ottawa. But for this Liberal government, it almost seems like transparency is like kryptonite. They're allergic to it. They say all the right words at the press conferences, but when it comes to releasing the facts on Arrican, Trans Mountain, on this 130 million entrepreneur fund, that produce startups, they hide, delay, redact, and then they stonewall. And then when the watchdogs and journalists demand truth for access under access of information, they fight in court. As a taxpayer, like not even like someone who reports on
They
this,
did
but
that
just
on the
as a
Winnipeg
taxpayer,
Lads. They took the House of Commons to court.
it's so frustrating. I want to come back a little bit back to the SDTC, Rick, because
Sure.
you mentioned Annette Verschuren, and I read through the reports, I watched the committee hearings. It almost seemed like it was a very much a culture change when Annette came in. They asked the questions like, what are we going to do about conflicts of interest? And when she came in, it was almost like open season, almost like when SNC Lavalin happened, when Trudeau protected SNC Lavalin, when we have agencies like that are protected by the government, it almost seems like it's open season for corruption. And you mentioned now Baines, he approved it. But why do you think the Liberals appointed someone like her in the first place? Was this just a case of like she did favors for the government and they're just scratching her back? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
It's a hard thing for me to explain who the Liberals appoint to anything. Annette will claim, and did claim in committee, that she gave money to both parties. And she may have. That's the way people sometimes cover it up. I believe a lot of her companies have survived on a lot of federal and provincial incentives, including the Verschuren Center, which she set up at Cape Breton University, which was in financial trouble, which also got SDTC money. She didn't own it, but she set it up as a vanity project to her family. But the crazy thing about this is there was that cultural change, as you said, because the former president of SDTC, who went through this transition, actually saw projects come back to the board after Verschuren was on that were ruled inadmissible prior to that, because there was a conflict of interest and were not considered by board members. Those board members actually brought them back when the culture changed and said, well, it's okay to have conflicted ones, just as long as you're not in the room when we you vote money. The worst of all, of course, was the COVID payments, which was a clear violation. All of them had interest in companies. Annette Verschuren, they voted $40 million through 2 votes of special money to their companies during COVID, because they said they were struggling. Like there were a couple of companies there that never asked, many of the companies never asked for any additional money, but in order for their companies to get it, they had to give it to everybody to sort of say, well, we weren't being treated special. Our companies, which are in trouble, are going to get the special COVID payment. Like there weren't enough business COVID payments out there that businesses could have got. They thought they would do their own. And the way they hid it was by saying every company in our portfolio gets it. Therefore, we're not providing any preferential treatment. Some of the companies that got this money had 100 months worth of cash available. Like they were not in financial trouble. And the only reason to give companies more cash is it increases the value. One other thing, though, in the world of commercial cutting edge green technology, it was a stamp of approval to going out and raising private money if you had the SDTC money and assistance already, because that brought a government of Canada approval of what you were doing, validation of what you were doing, which allowed you to go out and do this. One of the board members who runs a big venture capital company in Quebec was the most conflicted director, André Mateau, and her company, Cycle Capital, and had a lot of investments in companies that got money from SDTC. Some of the estimates were anywhere. She claimed it was only $10 million, like $10 million. There's no exclusion in the Conflict of Interest Act says you can be conflicted up to $10 million. And above that, you can't be conflicted. You got to recuse yourself. Like you can feather your bed. It doesn't say that. You can't be conflicted at all. But anywhere from 10 to $200 million were some of the evidence that came from various sources, including the whistleblower, that her company's got. Guess who worked for her company before he was elected? Stephen Guilbeault.
Oh, Jesus.
And Stephen Guilbeault lobbied the federal government in the 4 years before he was elected, from 2015 to 2019, lobbied the federal government 47 times on behalf of Cycle Capital. And they ended up getting tens and tens of millions of dollars during that period of time. That included lobbying everyone from Gerald Butts to the ministers. Navdeep Bains had meetings with him, but when he was before committee, he had amnesia. I don't remember. I met with a lot of people. You don't remember meeting with a guy who is the champion of environmental radicalism in this Liberal government, that he didn't remember him at all. Like, come on. That you had all of this going on in this feather bedding. And that's why we want these documents turned over to the RCMP, and we still want them. I am hopeful that when the House comes back, I'm not there anymore. Hopefully this is just a short-term sabbatical, but that this gets pushed again over to what's called PROC, the Procedures Committee, for them to actually rule on. It doesn't need to take up any more House time, but it does need to, the Speaker's ruling that the government was in breach needs to be dealt with by Parliament. It's a fundamental issue. And so I don't think it's going away, even though conflicted Mark Carney, who has probably more conflicts than anyone in the history of the government, including Sir John A., who had a lot of conflicts. But like we saw with his disclosure, his 800 and some conflicts with companies in Brookfield. I don't know how the guy can sit in a cabinet meeting. Pretty much everything they do, he'll be conflicted in.
Well, I mean, it's funny. Like it's funny that you mentioned like Mark Carney, his conflicts, and it wasn't until after the election that they actually released like some transparency of his conflicts, and it was wild to me that as a voter, it's wild to me to see that because it just signals a little bit more of the same, and and again, like, are we going to be more accountable? I mean, Mark Carney's already signaling to me that he's unaccountable. I mean, for me as a voter, I, I gave the Liberals a bit of a little bit of leeway when they first elected Justin Trudeau. Seemed like he was fun, but then as soon as SNC Lavalin happened, I'm a voter of principle, and if you're going to do that with this, what else are you going to do? And I think we saw a lot of what happened. We Charity, the STDC's cancel. It was cover up after cover up, ArriveCan, and it's like this government was allergic to transparency, allergic from accountability, accountable to they forget that they're actually public servants. And I think that they're not kings, they're public servants. And I think that that's the biggest takeaway I have of this Liberal government is that they forget their place, that they're not supposed to be enriching themselves. They're not supposed to be, lining Justin Trudeau's, some of his family was receiving speaking fees from the Kilburgers. I mean, it was just an egregious example of conflicts of interest. And, moving back to the SDTC, the Auditor General, as you said, found 186 conflicts of interest, 59 million funneled to ineligible projects, 59 million funneled to ineligible projects. And it almost seems like, how does a government agency get away with this? We know it's not the whistleblowers, because the whistleblowers did what they did. They blew louder. They went to, as you said, Champagne, Minister Champagne. He didn't do anything. What other recourses? Like, do we need better whistleblower protection? Rick, what are your thoughts on it?
100%. One of my colleagues on the committee at the time, a really good MP from Windsor West, at the time he lost in the election, Brian Massey, from the NDP. Brian was great to work with, and this was his thing that he talked quite a bit about through the Green Slush Fund stuff, was better protection for whistleblowers in order that this stuff can come forward. Like, this guy was brave, right? Like, he had no protection whatsoever. Now, he was no longer at SDTC, but he is still within the federal government, and he took a big chance by blowing the whistle on all of what was going on. Not everyone is that courageous, right? Or has access to the actual documents that, it's one thing to say it. It's another, like, he had actual documents and minutes of board meetings and all these things that he shared with people to show that this was going on, that allowed us to kick this off and bring it in. So, we do need way better protection for whistleblowers, but you can't legislate as much as you want and say, well, doesn't legislation cover that? You can't legislate against morals, right? Like, my expectation for a guy with the extensive business interests that Mark Carney had was not to abide by the letter of the law. But when you seek to be prime minister, and when you've been you've accumulated the wealth that he has over his years, to me, the obvious thing to do was to sell everything before he was sworn in as prime minister. And now he doesn't have to stop making money at it, but that cash can go into a blind trust, and the investment guys can invest it without him knowing where it's invested in, if it's in a blind trust. But the way he did it is he didn't sell any of it. He claimed he had sold it when he was running in the leadership and he didn't have any interest. Turns out that was a lie. That he actually hadn't sold anything, and he put everything in the shares that he had. He just rolled it over in the blind trust. So every decision that goes before cabinet, whether it's Westinghouse and small modular nuclear or any of these things that Brookfield had, the financial interest he had in promoting heat pumps and the companies that he had shares in, all those things he still owned shares in. If he had sold them all, and a team had then taken his money and invested it in things he couldn't see, because that's a true blind trust, people wouldn't have the same concern. But he didn't do that. So how does he approve a budget? Because a budget, we're going to have a budget in the fall. A budget has tax measures. Those tax measures are inevitably going to impact the companies that he has shares in. Even the discussions with Trump about Kuzma and the industries, or the tariffs, those impact his U.S. investments, of which he has a lot. There's nothing wrong with having those investments. I have shares in companies like Facebook as well. So, sure. but he knows he has those. So when he makes a decision that says, I own shares in Google, Facebook, and these big social media giants, and I'm getting rid of the digital services tax, guess who benefits?
Right.
The guy who owns shares in those companies. Even though the digital services tax was a dumb thing to start with, but the reality is he took it off, and people say, well, what did he get for it from Trump? I don't think he got anything for it from Trump, but the companies he owns shares in benefit from it.
Well, absolutely. And I think, I mean, like we talked about the digital service tax. I think it was a bad policy to begin with. I don't think anyone can say that it was a great policy. And this person that sold himself as one of the great negotiators of Trump that could handle Trump got absolutely nothing when he dropped that tax. So I mean, it says a lot about where we are with this government, and I'm really excited to see what happens come this fall session because we haven't had a lot of sitting days since the fall of last year and not a lot of accountability. And it's great because the few days of accountability this summer, it really hurt the Liberal government. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens this fall when we get the committees going, because I don't think the Canadians are going to sit or swallow another prorogued sitting. I think we're really much done with that. Rick, you mentioned the RCMP.
Mhm.
You mentioned like you mentioned that you push. I mean, look, everyone knows you push hard for the RCMP
Yeah.
investigations and documents release. You mentioned that it paralyzed Parliament, but with the ongoing probes and no charges yet, do you think this is just another Liberal cover-up like SNC, where
Well, yeah,
nothing ever
because
sticks? Or
they redacted so many of the 29,000 pages. The excuse the Liberals had in Parliament is they said, well, this is somehow the government can't start an investigation and this is breaching over and unconstitutional. And the way I explained it in Parliament, I said, look, you run a business. You find out that one of your employees is stealing from the business. Now, do you have to wait till the RCMP discover that and come in and ask you for permission? Or do you say, oh, I got a problem here, and I turn that over to the police? Of course you do. Well, you turn it over to the police and you let the police investigate, and the individual will suffer the consequences. We haven't done that here because when you have 29,000 pages, most of them blanked out, there's no way for the RCMP to actually get the documents and look at the documents that would shed some light on these conflicts. There is a potential. I'm not saying there is, but it sure looks to me like there was a conspiracy here of board directors to fund their own companies. And so I think that's what the RCMP need to investigate, and they can't investigate it unless they get the unredacted, the unedited documents. But the poor Liberals just wouldn't do that and said somehow this was unconstitutional. Well, as the owner of SDTC, of that business, so to speak, right? I think the owner of that business not only has a right, but has an obligation to turn documents over if they think there is something that's gone on that is against the law. And that's all Parliament did. Parliament said, we think there might be something here that's against the law, and those documents need to be turned over to the police for the police to determine whether that actually happens or not. And the Liberals are still refusing to do it.
if you're still in Parliament, like is this a problem with like Parliament, or is this a problem with does the RCMP just not have the tools to investigate this properly? Like, where do you think the problem is right now? Like,
Well,
is it
that's
is
where
it
they
like
hide behind cabinet confidences and commercial confidentiality and all this stuff. So the government can use all kinds of excuses to even keep documents from the RCMP unless Parliament actually intervenes. Um, and so that's the purpose of this. So could the RCMP get access to all the documents of the We Charity? I don't believe they could, because there was a bunch of documents around the cabinet decision-making process that was funneling those hundreds of millions of dollars to the We Charity that the Trudeau government would not turn over to the RCMP and use cabinet confidence as part of it. Remember, the Privy Council office is the Prime Minister's department. And in the case of SDTC, the Privy Council office told government departments to use the Privacy Act and commercial sensitivity to edit the documents. Now, that was not in the House of Commons motion. It was the Prime Minister's department. And guess who the two departments that redacted the most documents were? The Industry Department, where SDTC reported, and the Privy Council office, where they serve the Prime Minister. All of those documents are redacted. That's where the key is. Those are the key documents to try and understand what was going on. And They won't turn them over, just like they wouldn't turn them over using cabinet confidence in the We Charity. There wasn't a House order on the We Charity, but there is a House order on SDTC. There was a House order on the Winnipeg labs and the Chinese spies that were in the labs. And that they ignored that as well, and the Parliament had to go to court. And that got settled some way in court. So, so how do you change that? Well, you need cabinet confidence, right? You can't operate a government without cabinet confidence, without the ability of ministers in a meeting to be able to argue back and forth against their colleagues on an issue and not immediately be out in public. Because once cabinet makes a decision, all cabinet ministers have to support that decision. So you have to be able to protect those cabinet competences for those reasons, but for a limited period of time, but also for, in some cases, national security reasons. So that's a valid thing. It does get abused, I think, in some cases. And the prime minister can waive it. Like the prime minister could have waived cabinet confidence and turned the cabinet documents over on the We scandal charity, but chose not to.
Right. And I mean, even with this STC, like they're stonewalling the same issues. They don't want to release the information. They don't want the public to see what's happening. I for one want to see what's behind those documents. I think it would signal to a lot of Canadian taxpayers that this is no longer business as usual.
And I'd love to have that investigation. And at the end of the day, as I said in the House to many Liberals, prove us wrong. Release the documents. Prove us wrong, and let the RCMP, not Parliament, but let the RCMP determine whether there was anything here that is chargeable under the criminal code or not. But let the RCMP determine that. But by redacting documents and basically inhibiting the investigation of the RCMP, they're preventing that clarity. And I'm sure the directors or the former directors, because basically they collapsed all our pressure, they collapsed the SDTC, they got rid of it, and they buried its programs in the National Research Council. So it's no longer transparent. At least with SDTC, every quarter they put out a spreadsheet of what they invested in, how much money they invested in, what the company was. NRC doesn't do any of that. These programs on these green technology companies are now buried in the National Research Council under the folks that manage several of the business programs there, and there is zero transparency as to where any of that money is going. There's no longer quarterly reports of what companies are getting what money under those funds. It's gone. The money's still going out, but the transparency of who's getting it is completely gone.
How would Canadians get that info? Like, how do you see that? I understand, like what you're saying is that.
Well, you can file an access to information request, and my office filed 253 of them last summer on when I was still a member of Parliament on a variety of things. And you get some interesting answers. Sometimes it takes forever, and sometimes you get stonewalling. We asked for the deputy minister's schedule for the last year, and the Innovation and Science and Industry Department came back in a response to my ATIP and said it would take 5 years.
5 years.
5 years to get his agenda for 1 year. So I can recall in committee having the deputy minister there saying, "You're the deputy minister of innovation, science, and industry. So I'll send my 23-year-old assistant over and do classes on how to print out a schedule in Outlook. So you open up the day and you hit file and print, and it'll take you probably about 2 hours to print out your full year schedule, not 5 to 7 years." Like this is the problem sometimes of even things like access to information, is that you get ridiculous stonewalling responses like that.
I want to, we're in the theme of government waste, Rick. And, I want to kind of come back to this major projects office, because I think that's the next big thing. We're going to still deal with STD, the Sustainable Technology Development Canada, but now we have this major projects office.
I hope it works.
Yeah.
Right? Good of the country is we get some pipelines built, we get some LNG plants built, and we get them built quick. I hope it works. It's taken 180 days for him to announce an office in Germany. No projects, nothing applied, no projects, nothing, no process, no anything. But in Germany, then 180 days, they got permitted and built an LNG plant in 180 days. So the time that Mark Carney's been in power, he could have permitted and built an LNG plant if he had done the job right. But no, it was on creating an office. If it takes 180 days to open up an office, and it took years for the infrastructure bank to actually invest in anything, the bank of nothing. So with $15 billion, like, how realistic is it that in the next 2 years, we're going to get something built? I don't think it's going to happen. And in order to do it, they won't get rid of their C-69 environment bill, the Impact Assessment Act. They'll just exempt certain projects from it, but other projects will still have to go through it. So if you don't make the offices cut or cabinets cut, and you say, well, we still want to build this pipeline, but it doesn't make the short list, then you're going to have to go through this process that takes 10 to 15 years. If you've got a mine that you want to mine critical minerals on or potash on, and it's not on Mark Carney's and the project office's list, it's going to take you 15 years to get permitted. So that's why the Conservatives have been saying what we need to do is get rid of the laws that make that a 15-year process. Don't worry about opening up a project office. Get rid of the bureaucracy that's in it, not just the bureaucracy for one or two projects, but the bureaucracy for all the projects so we can get stuff done.
Let me ask you a question. Like, we obviously there's a pattern. We have SDTC, ArriveCan, and I'd love to see. I want them to succeed as much as you do. Every Canadian, I want to see this party concede. But I think the lack of transparency, it's a signal of a lot, to me at least, that this is just more of the same. And when we talk about accountability and what it looks like, if you're in government right tomorrow, what's the very first reform you push to make sure taxpayers know exactly where their money is going?
Well, our number one bill was going to be getting rid of the carbon tax, but shortly behind that, in the election this year, would have been rescinding C-69 and C-48, the no pipeline bill and the no tanker bill. Like you actually can't take the large overseas oil tankers and tankers that you need to transport these goods off the BC coast. The Liberals, so you can build pipelines there, but they can only do intercoastal stuff. So a lot of the oil that actually comes out of the Trans-Canada pipeline now actually goes to the U.S. because of the limits of the harbor that they ended the pipeline in, and the limits of the no tanker bill. So those are the things that we would get in place. And the first priority would be to put in place that can get projects done in under a year, and with a target of 6 months to get the project approval done, including dealing with the Indigenous rights and ownership. The Liberal government hasn't come up with any new ideas about how they're going to actually do this. We had some. I won't share them here because they were part of a plan for governing, but I haven't seen anything advanced. So right now you still have, and you've seen with Assembly First Nations actually today, I think, is meeting in Winnipeg and discussing the C5 exemption list and how First Nations are going to participate or not participate in that process. So they still haven't got a solution on an important part of what the courts have ruled on how to get projects done. And so that would have been our priority, because look, when you're in business, I spent a lot of years in business, you've been in business, you find your competitive advantage, right? Find my competitive advantage, and I work hard to maintain that, and I'll evolve it as a business if I have to evolve it. Markets move quickly, and your competitive advantage can disappear quickly. What's our competitive advantage, Canada and the world? Our competitive advantages are renewable and our non-renewable resources. So the renewable ones being forestry, fisheries, dear to my heart here in Nova Scotia, agriculture, non-renewables, mining, oil and gas, those kinds of things. We're blessed, Canada, with everything. And I've never heard Saudi Arabia say, I'm sure glad I don't have all those trees to manage like Canada. Like, why is it that we've had a government for 10 years, and now the Carney government, who I believe is still bent because his book Values lays out his true genetic feelings about some of our industries. Why is it that we have had a government, a liberal government, who believes that we should not uh, we should put in laws that prohibit our competitive advantage from actually working? We have a wealth issue in this country. We have a capital issue in this country. We have a productivity issue. Things cost more and more every day. And one of the reasons is because our incomes aren't growing as fast as the Americans are. And while the cost of all the goods go up, the American incomes are now 40% richer than we are in 10 years. And that's why it's like, why is it that I may have got a little bit of a raise at work, but I still can't seem to catch up to where I was? It's because our incomes haven't grown like the Americans. And it's because we have tried, our government, the Liberal government of Canada, it's not my government, but the Liberal government of Canada has tried to kill our resource industries and continues to try and do it. And I can't think of anything more economically stupid than that. And Mark Carney professes to be some sort of economic genius, but he leads a government who still won't remove Bill C-69 and C-48, which are the major impediments to us developing our resource industries. And our economy has just shrunk massively as a result of that over the last 10 years. And until those bills are gone, we're not going to see a change in our economic outlook. We're going to get diminished. And now you pile on top of it Trump's tariffs on top of an economy. We got a government that put us in a horrible place with no room to spend, no room to grow. And the only way to grow now is to build these resource industries, renewables and non-renewables again. And I just don't have any belief that the Liberals are going to do it. I sure hope they do, but I just don't see it happening.
No, and I agree with you. I think I think that we're stuck in like an ideological phase. I think that ideology is trumping reason and science. It's one of the most frustrating things about, watching this government work for the last 10 years is that they'll tell you that the sky's purple, but everyone knows it's blue. But we could go on for hours about that.
Look,
Rick,
the EV mandates, right? The EV
yeah,
batteries. One of the big things I went after in my time, I've actually read, I'm one of the few parliamentarians that was given access to the contracts with Stellantis and VW on the EV battery plants. We just heard that, the Quebec government's out $250 million on the Northvolt battery plant boondoggle. They made a bet. Champagne, again, this guy's in charge of our finances. He made a bet and convinced everyone that what I believe to be the Betamax of batteries, you have to be a certain age to know what a Betamax was, but the Betamax of batteries, the lithium ion battery for electric vehicles, is the bet that he wanted to make. I certainly think that there is a valuable goal to try and get to the point at some point in the next couple decades to zero emission vehicles. I just don't think the government should be picking the technology. I think the multiple technologies that'll come about out of this to have a zero emission, and I believe they'll come up with a zero emission internal combustion engine, that the industry and the markets should drive those solutions. And what I need in a rural riding is different than somebody who lives in downtown Toronto and never leaves and can drive around in their 100% EV vehicle with charging stations everywhere, where there are virtually no charging stations in the South Shore of Nova Scotia where I live. And so hybrids are a solution. And I believe if you said that we're going to get there, but the unrealistic thing that they're going to start fining dealerships and automakers next year when Trump is attacking our auto industry and now saying we're going to start fining them if they don't sell 20% of their vehicles being EVs next year. Well, first of all, the market doesn't want them. As soon as they took the subsidies off, the sales went in the toilet because they're not competitive. And so now there's no production. They've slowed down or even stopped production in Canada, a lot of EVs. Ford brought in the Lightning truck. They don't even make them anymore. And so now they've got these mandates still in place. And even if dealerships wanted to sell them, there isn't product to sell and there isn't a market demand to do it, all on an old technology. The Dalhousie battery plant here in Nova Scotia has been working on replacement batteries. They've got batteries, they've got functioning using salt water, saline. They've got lithium ion batteries that are the size of a business card. They're thin, like an after 8 dinner mint that they're running through. The lithium ion batteries that are in your vehicle now in a big box are like a bunch of AA batteries all lined up. It's why they're so heavy. Like there's a lot of innovation going on. So
Right.
why would the government pick the technology? You can set an emission standard for some year in the future of zero if you want, but why pick the technology? Let the private sector and the market figure it out and drive the technology. And
Right.
it'll be
No,
multiple technologies, right? It's not going to be one solution for everybody.
well, I think it's funny that like I think we talked about before our interview about timing.
Well, that's $52 billion
Yeah.
that they promised to some of the largest automakers in the world of your money, the biggest subsidies ever to business, $52 billion to 3 companies to
Right.
build lithium ion batteries for cars that nobody's buying.
And I think like, you know, back to what I was saying about timing, they were announcing these battery plants at a time when, you know, Donald Trump was leading in the polls. He said he was going to rip up
The IRA.
Yeah, the IRA. You know, and I remember watching Chrystia Freeland, the former finance minister, you know, I believe she was in Nova Scotia. She was promoting wind turbines, and someone was asking, like, you said that there was a race for these green technologies. Like, who are we in a race with? She couldn't answer. She's like, well, we'll see. We'll see who we're a race with in a couple of years. And the race seems to be with ourselves. Like, we're just the race to the bottom. And I found it like watching this. It's like, okay, well, if we're going to introduce policy about green tech, who are our stakeholders? Because if it's Donald Trump, it's not the U.S. So who does that leave? It obviously leaves us, the Canadians, with the biggest burden to like push this tech. So as a taxpayer, as someone that's watching policy, it's very frustrating to watch that kind of policy be enacted. Because again, like as you said, it's just wasted tax dollars. And I mentioned at the beginning of this interview, 48% of our income goes towards the government. And it's not till Wednesday that we're actually earning money for ourselves. And that's the most frustrating thing as a Canadian, as someone that's dealing with this government aid.
Most people don't get tax freedom day till the middle of July, meaning they're working in the first half of the year basically to pay taxes.
Rick, it's been great having you on. You know, we've covered a lot today: waste, secrecy, you know, the culture of unaccountability in government. Before we wrap up, where can people find you? How can listeners follow your work?
Well, I'm probably most frequent on Twitter X on Rick Perkins CPC. That's where I'm most active these days. So and doing podcasts. So anytime you want me back, Dan, I'd love to be back. There's a lot of great folks out there. I know you know lots of them, from Jasmine Lane to yourself to the Elevate guys. I got to do some stuff with the Elevate. I like the Elevate guys because they're here in Nova Scotia too. So
it's the worst part about being West, lining up times, like being on the West Coast and trying to line up like times. It's so hard. So
well, and there are great people like Andy Lee. Like we haven't even gotten into China.
No, not at all.
You know, there's a whole thing on China, right? But you ask who the competitors are. It's China. Whether it's national security, whether it's taking over my lobster buyers, whether it's buying mineral rights, whether it's trying to get their spy vehicles from BYD into Canada, you know, whether it's Trump talking about Greenland and Panama Canal, all of that's about China.
Right. No, and I don't. I mean, they're one of. I think that was another thing that we've, you know, as Canadians, it's not highlighted enough. Why, you know, they're a communist country, and here we are giving them $1.5 billion to build our ferries. And then people are like, well, Canada's not competitive. We just can't build them in Canada. I'm like, yeah, like there's a reason why. Is we offshore it.
And even if that were true, Dan, surely we can find a shipyard in a democracy.
I think so too.
You know, we are looking at buying ships from South Korea. We're looking at subs from Germany. We're looking at Norway, who make Polar Class 1 icebreakers. Like, there are shipyards around the world. There is a nice one in Vancouver. There's a pretty good one here in Halifax. There's Davy Shipyard. Yeah, like there's lots of options.
I mean, we're
the Davy
spending $60
Shipyard
billion
in Quebec. You know,
I mean,
like,
we're spending $60 billion on a defunct battery plants, Rick. I'm certain that we can find a couple billion from that fund to build a shipyard over on the east or west coast. Like, come
yeah,
on. Like, I honestly, it frustrates me more than anyone when we have this capitulation about how we can't build in Canada, because we can build in Canada. We have some of
we
the
choose
smartest
not to.
people in the country, and it's just so frustrating to hear that, oh, we're just not
Yeah.
competitive. No, it's not that. It's just we don't have the will.
AI data centers, you know, they've got a $2 billion fund in the industry department. They've put out one thing, $240 million to a Canadian company called Cohere. I get that.
Yeah.
And it'll be in Canada. But guess who's going to run it? An
Yeah.
American company. An American company is going to run it. So they will have access in the AI data world. So like, you know, we'll build it, but the Americans are going to get the jobs out of it. They're going to be running it. Like, this is crazy that we would give access to our AI data. It just goes on and on. It actually, folks, it can get pretty depressing, I can tell you.
Go down the rabbit hole.
When you're in Ottawa and you start going through these things, like, and saying, like, who makes these decisions? Who looks at it? You know, we didn't talk about the money to Telesat. The Minister of Industry and Committee, they gave $1 billion to put up satellites to Telesat, essentially bankrupt company. And the minister said, "Why are you dragging down a Canadian company?" I said, "Wait a minute here. You're bailing out a company run by Mark Carney's friend that has $700 million of revenue, and with this loan will have $500 million of interest payments on debt. So that means they're bankrupt. And they're 63% owned by New York hedge funds. You don't even know that you're bailing out New York hedge funds? Like, it doesn't take much. It takes 5 minutes to look some of these things up on the internet, right? On Edgar, which is the US version of where public companies are traded, and you get information on a CDR here in Canada. Like, this stuff is public, and they have an entire industry department. And the Minister of Industry was surprised when I told him that the company he had just given a whack of money to, that's run by Mark Carney's buddy, who was at Mark Carney swearing in, was bankrupt and owned by American hedge funds.
What, like, why do they put these, like, it almost seems like they put the most incompetent ministers in charge of these departments. And I want to be clear, like, you get more money to become a minister. Am I?
Yeah, about $80,000 more. About $80,000 a year more.
So you get a sizable, increase
to
your
staff.
income.
You have millions of dollars a year for your political staff in your office. So, okay, the minister's busy, but I was a staffer. I was a staffer in the Brian Mulroney government.
Right.
I mean, this is the work I did when I was a young guy in my 20s. I made sure I had all that information for the boss. Like, I would never let something come up to my boss and say, yeah, we're giving this money to a company that says they're Canadian, but are actually owned by Americans. Like, just ask the question, who owns the company?
I don't think they care. I think the sad thing is just they don't care.
Well, you know, this has always been a government of announcements. Remember, and not delivery. Remember, I know we were about to wrap up, but when Justin Trudeau got elected in 2015, he talked about deliverology. He brought over this great British Labour guy who was going to teach them how to actually get stuff done rather than just make announcements. All they do is make announcements. All Carney's been doing. He's made 10 trips to Europe on intentions to maybe look at something sometime in the future, and we'll sign a press release that says this with a disclaimer at the bottom saying this isn't an agreement, but call it a sort of MOU intention to, you know, like
intention
to trade. Let's go for a coffee someday.
Yeah.
Like
intention to trade minerals. That's great. Like, there's no contract signed, just intention, like a lot of good feelings.
I think he has spent more time in Europe this summer than he has anywhere else. But, you know, of course he did say at a conference that he was European, not Canadian.
Oh, so I think it's one of the biggest frustrations. And, you know, and I'd love to talk to you again, Rick, about what this government's doing in Europe, what they've done, like what the mistakes they made this summer. I hope I can talk to you soon. I appreciate you spending some time there, Rick. I really do appreciate it. Thanks, Rick.
It's been fun. Take care.
If you're still here, good. It means you're paying attention. It means you're not asleep. You're not gaslit. You haven't been bought by the media spin or the liberal fairy tale that everything is fine while the country burns. I'm Dan Knight, and this is The Opposition. They have the consultants, they have the lobbyists, they have the legacy press, CBC, CTV, Global, spoon-feeding you government-approved talking points like it's North Korea, but with a better wardrobe. But we have each other. We've got the truth, we've got the grit, and we have the absolute audacity to stand up and say, no more. No more fake budgets, no more climate virtue signaling while our economy crumbles. No more surrendering your sovereignty to Brussels, Beijing, or Beltway elites. You can find me on Substack or Twitter, Dan Knight MMA, or on Instagram, and wherever honest Canadians are still allowed to speak freely. If you like what you heard, like it, share it, send it to someone who still thinks for themselves. We are building something here, not just commentary, but a coalition, a resistance to the rot, a community that refuses to bow, bend, or beg for permission. They have the legacy media, but we have you. And if we stick together, they don't stand a chance. Let's make it count. I'll see you on the next episode of The Opposition.